Welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm Dr. John McLean, and in this session I will do a biblical evaluation of restitution and reparation. This will be done within the context of American slavery and the current discussion, which has been going on for some time, about reparation to African American or black people for the evil and ungodly behavior of some early colonists and then Americans with the slavery, the chattel slavery of not just black Americans, but there were others, sometimes white and other ethnic groups. Now, the Bible does not use the word reparation in any translation to the best of my knowledge, but the word restitution is used, and at times these two words can be synonyms, and at other times there is a slight differentiation. Restitution in the Bible is clearly stated. Reparation might be found in principle. And so just let's look at some of the scriptures and then talk about what the challenge is for a Christian and a biblical evaluation. See my post on slavery because I deal with slavery, and that is important to understand the difference between the chattel slavery of American experience, European experience, North and South America, and that of slavery in the Bible. They are really two completely different things, and there were completely different laws in the Old Testament applying to that. But some of the ones that deal with restitution that may be a place to start to talk about reparations is, of course, Exodus chapter 12, verses 35 and 36. It says, "Now the sons of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, for they had requested from the Egyptians articles of silver and gold and clothing, and the Lord God had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have their request. Thus they plundered the Egyptians." Now this is at the end of the 10 plagues, and as a result of the death of the firstborn, the Egyptians had been harmful and harsh to the people of Israel, the people of God. And so when they are leaving, the Egyptians are willing to, they're not compelled to, but they're willing to make restitution. We might even use the word reparation in this context for the oppressive slavery, the killing of Israel or Jewish people, Hebrew people at that time. But notice that it was requested and then it was granted. It was not something that was imposed or mandated or legally required, and it was part of God's will for the Hebrew people as a nation when they were leaving Egypt to be able to take those things that they could use to sustain them as they entered into the promised land. But this was something that was done concurrently with the offenders and the offended, and within that time of the people. Exodus chapter 21, verse 33 says, "If a man opens a pit or digs a pit and does not cover it over at night or when he's not there, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit shall make restitution. It's not the word reparation. He shall give money to its owner, and the dead animal shall become his. This is because of irresponsible actions that lead to harm. This is, again, concurrent with the violation. This is more of restitution in a judicial sense rather than a reparation. Going on in verse 35 of that chapter, if one man's ox hurts another's so that it dies, then they shall sell the live ox and divide its price equally. And also they shall divide the dead ox for the meat. Or if it is known that the ox was previously in the habit of goring, yet its owner has not confined it, done that which is responsible, he shall surely pay ox for ox, and the dead animal shall become his. So here we have irresponsible ownership that leads to harm. In this, there is a restitution within the concurrent guilty party to that person who was violated. If a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he shall pay 5 oxen for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. Now, this is in the context of stealing or theft. If the thief is caught while breaking in and is struck so that he dies, there will be no blood guiltness on his account. This is part of the self-defense that I talk about in another blog or log. But if the sun has risen on him, there will be blood guiltness on his account because the owner of the home or the animal did not seek to bring healing or comfort or first aid to him. He shall surely make restitution. If he owns nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. In other words, he will go into slavery. But this is not the chattel slavery, but a slavery in which he will be under the owner's guidance, governance, and work until he has paid off his debt. If what he stole is actually found alive in his possession, whether an ox or a donkey or a sheep, he shall pay double. So there are different levels of restitution for stealing. If a man lets a field or a vineyard be grazed bare and lets his animal loose so that it grazes in another man's field, he shall make restitution for the best of his own field and the best of his own vineyard. Now, this has to do with purposeful negligence, that you allow your animal or animals to graze in somebody else's field or vineyard and completely destroy it. There must be restitution made. If a fire breaks out and spreads to thorn bushes so that stacked grain or the standing grain or the field itself is consumed, he who started the fire shall surely make restitution, and that will be equal restitution. This again is purposeful negligence. A principle maybe could be built for reparations, but this is certainly not within the context of slavery. Another example that we could look at in verse 7, if a man gives his neighbor money or goods to keep for him, and it is stolen from the man's house, if the thief is caught, he shall pay double, the thief, restitution. If the thief is not caught, then the owner of the house shall appear before the judges to determine whether he laid his hands on his neighbor's property. Is there a witness? Are there circumstantial circumstances that can provide some evidence. For every breach of trust, whether it is for ox, for donkey, for sheep, for clothing, or for any other thing about which one says, this is it. In other words, making an accusation, the case of both parties shall come before the judges. He whom the judges condemn shall pay double to his neighbor. This is a legal restitution. If a man gives his neighbor a donkey, an ox, a sheep, or any animal to keep for him, and it dies or is hurt or is driven away while no one is looking. So the Old Testament makes examples for restitution within a concurrent complaint of one person against another. An oath before the Lord shall be made by the two of them, that he has not laid hands on his neighbor's property, and its owner shall accept it, and he shall not make restitution. If there is some kind of an agreement, restitution is not necessary. But if it is actually stolen from him, he shall make restitution to its owner. If it is torn to pieces, let him bring it as evidence. He shall not make restitution for what has been torn to pieces. In other words, if the man is not at fault for some quote-unquote act of God or act of nature. If a man borrows anything from his neighbor and it is injured or dies while its owner is not with it, he shall make full restitution. If its owner is with it, he shall not make restitution. If it is hired, it came for its hire. And so this deals with loaning things, loaning animals, loaning property, loaning that to another. If there is loan negligence, if there is negligence of what has been given to someone else for a period of time to use, then if they don't care for it, there must be restitution. If it's an act of God or act of nature, then the restitution is not required. It's the idea of when a neighbor loans you something, you need to bring it back in the same condition according to the agreement that you have made. We have an example in 2 Samuel 12, 5 and 6, which is sometimes spoken of as an argument for reparations. It says, and this is after Nathan confronts David over this parabolic story of the rich man who stole the poor man's lamb. It says, then David's anger burned greatly against the man in the story, and the reason would particularly have been that David was a shepherd, and he knew how important it was to care for sheep, and that if a man was down to one lamb, that was the last of his survival. And he said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, surely the man who has done this deserves to die. Now, this is David speaking as the king, not necessarily based on a specific law. He must make restitution for the lamb fourfold, that's the rich man, because he did this thing and had no compassion. Now, what David did not understand was he was condemning himself for stealing Bathsheba, but it is an illustration of theft. Proverbs chapter 6, 30 and 31. Men do not despise a thief if he steals to satisfy himself when he is hungry. But when he is found, he must repay sevenfold. He must give all the substance of his house. So in a situation where a man is stealing something to simply feed himself or feed his family, there needs to be compassionate understanding. Yet in that compassionate understanding, the man needs to repay for that theft sevenfold. And so he must go to his own house, and whatever he has must be forfeited to make the sevenfold payment. Other laws would also suggest that he would have to become a servant or slave to the other man for a period of time until the debt was paid. Some people want to point to the story of Zacchaeus in the New Testament as an example of reparations. But here again, it doesn't deal with slavery, and it is more of a restitution. When Jesus called down Zacchaeus from the tree and told him that he was going to be at his house, which showed that Jesus was accepting him and was, in a sense, forgiving him and would fellowship with him, Zacchaeus stopped and said to the Lord, "Behold, Lord, half of my possessions I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone, cheated anyone of anything, I will give back 4 times as much." So Zacchaeus had become wealthy as a tax collector, as a businessman, and at times might even have cheated or defrauded people. And if they could come to him, and or he could remember it, he would pay down 4 times as much. But he would, out of his wealth, he would give to the poor. And so this is a principle that is not necessarily one of reparations. It certainly doesn't deal with slavery, but it deals with the attitude of what Christians who are wealthy should do, and even for others, and that he would give to the poor out of his abundance. This is also illustrated in Paul in writing to the Ephesians and talking about godly Christian living. He says, "He who steals must steal no longer, but rather he must labor, performing with his own hands what is good, so that he will have something to share with the one who has a need." How do you go back and pay back the things you've stolen? And, if you remember, if you don't remember, if the person is alive or not alive. But what you do instead is you stop the evil and you start to work and you start the good. And the good is to work to pay back by giving back to those who are in need. Leviticus chapter 24, verses 18 through 21 is another passage that is cited for reparations, but I would suggest that this deals with justice and not restitution. The one who takes the life of an animal shall make it good, life for life. If you kill somebody's animal, you've got to replace that animal with an animal. If a man injures his neighbor, just as he has done, so it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Just as he has injured a man, so it shall be inflicted on him. But one of the things we need to notice here is that this is not mandated, but it is a restriction also, in the sense that in vengeance we usually want more than just to get even. We want to get ahead. And this is restricting the revenge or the justice to an equality. Thus, the one who kills an animal shall make it good, but the one who kills a man shall be put to death. Death for death. You can't replace the life of humanity. So I think this is talking more about justice and not restitution. Numbers chapter 5, another example that is sometimes used of restitution or reparation. Numbers 5, it says, "Speak to the sons of Israel, when a man or a woman commits any of the sins of mankind," and of course in the law it defines those and in Numbers it defines some of those. Acting unfaithfully against the Lord. In other words, when you violate your neighbor, you're violating the Lord. And that person is guilty. They are found guilty by the judicial system. Then he shall confess his sins which he has committed, and he shall make restitution in full for his wrong, and add to it 1/5 of it, and give it to him whom he has wronged. And so this is within the context of Israel as a community, as a nation, the government in a sense being involved. It goes on. But if the man has no relative to whom restoration may be made for the wrong, the restitution which is made for the wrong must go to the Lord for the priest, besides the ram of atonement by which atonement is made for him. So the person who has done the wrong must find forgiveness and atonement with the Lord, forgiveness and atonement with the family. But if the man has no relative, in other words, if there is no, this is the word kinsman redeemer or goel, and in this situation, the kinsman or the redeemer, the goel, would have taken over the property, would have taken over the rights of the person who was violated. And so if the man to whom restoration is not available, and the relative that would have taken over his property and his household and his financial situation, if he's not available, in other words, if restitution can't be made properly to another human being or relative, then restitution still has to be made, but it must go to the Lord to support the priest. So this is a passage, again, that is really not speaking of reparations within the context of American sins. Deuteronomy 15:12 through 17. If your kinsman, a Hebrew man or woman, is sold to you, then he shall serve you 6 years, but in the 7th year you shall set him free. And of course, the man or woman would have gone into slavery, either willfully or for debt or other reasons, which I mention in my blog or video log on the slavery. Verse 13, when you set him free, you shall not send him away empty-handed. In other words, when the period of slavery or indebtedness is complete, then the person is to be sent out with things so that they can be successful. They've worked for you, they've paid their debt, and now they are to go free, but not to go free empty-handed. So this might be, I think, one of the only passages or main passages that makes a good biblical argument for reparations. It says, you shall furnish him liberally from your flock and from your threshing floor and from your wine vat. So he's going to have food, he's going to have a way of sustaining himself, he's going to have what he needs to drink. You shall give to him as the Lord your God has blessed you. I would say that would be proportionately as to how well he has helped you. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore I command you this day, it shall come about if he says to you, I will not go out from you, because he loves you and your household, since he fares well with you. In other words, if a relationship has developed over the years of your kindness and your goodness and his good work and a love and a friendship between you, then that person has the right to have a relationship with you through an indentured slavery or through a committed relationship to you, then you shall take an awl and pierce it through his ear into the door. That's to provide long-term proof through this ceremony, which would be witnessed by the community, and he shall be your servant forever. No longer an indebted slave, but now as a servant. And so in this situation, we see that when there is a voluntary slavery due to the circumstances defined in the Old Testament, when that debt is paid or that contract is completed, there is a need for the owner to provide reimbursement, reparation, or willing support so that the person has the opportunity to be successful. But here again, it's within the concurrent relationship of these people. The Bible does not impute sins from one generation to the next if the same sins are not committed. And that's the difficulty with the discussion of reparations for today. The difficulty is that it is not within the time frame of the person who violated another. And the Bible does not see or teach this kind of generational reparations. Ezekiel chapter 18, verses 19 and 20. It says, "Yet you shall say, why should the son bear the punishment for the father's iniquity? When the son has practiced justice and righteousness, and has observed all my statutes and done them, he shall surely live. The person who sins shall die or will die. The son will not bear the punishment for the father's iniquity, nor will the father bear the punishment for the son's iniquity. The righteousness of the righteous will be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked will be upon himself." And so we see this principle in the Old Testament, that a person does not pay for somebody else's sins or violations, and that one generation should not be held accountable for another generation's sins. Some questions for determining reparations. Maybe reparations are appropriate. Certainly restitution is appropriate at times. But when we talk about American reparations, there are some hard questions that we have to ask ourselves to come to a proper conclusion. First of all, how do you determine who in America should pay for reparations? Should those like my family who didn't come to America until the 1920s, who had nothing to do with American history or slavery or any kind of slavery? In fact, we were persecuted people in Europe, and we were enslaved at times. Why should people who had nothing to do with American slavery pay for this reparations? And I know that there are some who argue that, well, we have prospered from it. Well, that's a fallacious argument. You find in American history that it's the northern states who abolished slavery, primarily, who benefited from everyone working, and it was the southern states that continued with slavery that really faulted financially and defaulted financially. So I think there is a principle in Scripture that you don't have to pay for your generational sins if you didn't participate, and that only if you were guilty should you be providing restitution. So how do you determine who in America? Because white people had slaves. Indians had slaves. Black people had slaves. All ethnic people had slaves. And, how do you determine that? Secondly, how do you determine who in America should receive reparations? Now, yes, slavery was primarily done to black people, but white people were in slavery. Black people owned white people and black people. So how do you determine? How do you determine with those who immigrated to America after freedom was brought and liberty was restored to all human beings as God intended? How do you determine who? How do you determine the appropriate amount for reparations? Do you tax, or do you say the middle class or above of blacks are going to be excluded because they have been successful? I mean, how do you determine the appropriate amount for reparations over time? How do you reward those who oppose slavery? In this scheme of reparations, are you going to reward or reparate those who fought in the North and lost loved ones? Because the Civil War was in part about slavery. It was much more than slavery. I'm not going to argue it was only about slavery, but there were people who went to war. There were people who became part of the underground network. There were people who, and pastors and others who spoke out against it, and they paid at times up to their life in the efforts that they had to oppose this. So how do you determine the appropriate amount for reparations, and how do you reward those who opposed slavery and who paid for it and at times financed the opposition to slavery? How do you provide reparation for someone who has diverse DNA? What percentage of black DNA, if I could say it that way, does a person have to have in order to qualify for the reparations? And even the difficulty that we have become such a mixed community now in America, and a blended community with so many different ethnicities now integrating through marriage and other sexual relationships. How do you figure that all out? And finally, should middle class or above blacks be excluded since they have been successful? Is it only the poor amongst the blacks? And why are they poor? And should middle class or below whites or other ethnic groups that have a background of slavery, should they be a part of the reparations? Reparations is a valid question. The Bible does not address it as specifically as we would probably want, but these are questions that should be determined and be a part of the discussion. Clearly, the Bible does teach us as Christians that we are to love each other, to care for each other, to forgive each other, and even, if possible, to forget about these things and to promote harmony and peace. Nothing that America does today can make right the evil of the chattel slavery of the past. Yes, America had less than 4% of all of those that were taken out of Africa and other nations and brought throughout the world. Only 4%. But if it were 0.4%, it is still evil and wrong. And it needs to be recognized, and it needs to be forgiven.